Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National. Just wanted to give a quick intro before we dive into a very big conversation today to let you know that today's conversation was pre-recorded as we await a ruling in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is a pending U.S. Supreme Court case about the constitutionality of a 2018 Mississippi state law, which bans most abortion after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. A very big and important conversation, especially in light of the leaked opinion that came from the Supreme Court a number of weeks ago, in particular how it relates to Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So without further delay, let's bring on our host, Jean Marie Nevada.
Hey, everybody, let's get this week's conversation going. So just as a reminder, if you are joining us online and you would like to follow along, you can visit straightforequality.org/discussion series, which is where you will find this week's article. And this week's article actually was done by Julie Moreau from NBC News. And the title was What Roe versus Wade's End Could Mean for LGBTQ Rights. So there are many connections. A lot of people are just coming to this conversation. Some of us have been having it for a very long time. But given the situation we are looking at, I think it's important that we bring in some really smart people with some really, really deep understanding of this to help us navigate what is happening around us and what we need to do next. And so with that, I am going to bring in our two guests, Lauren LaVare, who's a senior organizer for the LGBTQ task force, and Gillian, Branstetter, communication strategist with the ACLU. It is so nice to have both of you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So I was wondering, and Gillian, maybe we can start with you. If you could both tell people a little bit about the organizations that you work for. So for people who may not be super familiar with them, the best way to connect and a little bit about your missions.
Sure. So I'm coming today from the American Civil Liberties Union, which I assume a lot of people will be familiar with, but I'm the communication strategist on behalf of the LGBT and HIV Project, as well as the Women's Rights Project here at the ACLU. So broadly speaking, the LGBT and HIV Project is involved in impact litigation, so taking cases to court, standing up for the rights of LGBT people in this country. That is obviously, as many viewers here will know, extremely pertinent right now. And we have many active cases challenging many of the bad state bills, for example, we've seen introduced around the country defending the rights of transgender youth to life-saving, gender-affirming healthcare, their rights to safe schools, and their rights to participate in athletics. Well as, across a variety of issues, the safety and dignity of LGBT people in our nation's carceral system, the rights of transgender people to share their stories and to express themselves how they wish, their First Amendment rights to live free of censorship by the state. And across our Women's Rights Project, we're engaging in a broad range of issues, from the rights of pregnant workers to the rights of nursing workers, to expanding the rights of sexual assault survivors. So not a dull moment at the ACLU.
A few things to talk about at the ACLU. I appreciate you talking about that because I don't think that everybody fully understands the scope of how broad the work at the ACLU is doing. And Lauren, I should have noted that you are the Federal Policy Counsel at the LGBTQ Task Force. I'm sorry about that. Could you tell people a little bit about what the task force does? It has been around a very long time.
Yes, it has. Yes, thank you. That was just a correction in case someone asked me about organizing, and I would not be the expert to ask for that. But yes, the task force is the oldest LGBTQ plus advocacy organization in the U.S. We've trained and mobilized millions of activists across our nation to end discrimination and barriers for LGBTQ plus people. Specifically, our areas are working in queering democracy, queering faith, and queering reproductive justice. At the task force, we recognize that everyone has a fundamental right to sexual health and bodily autonomy, which includes the right whether or not to become a parent, to parent a child that we have, and to do so with dignity, free from violence and discrimination. So a lot of our work involves coalition advocacy. We do amicus brief support, field activation through our action fund. So we also have a C4 action fund that works on lobbying efforts. The Equality Act is a huge kind of piece of legislation that is vital to our orgs and many other orgs as well. We also conduct specific research on healthcare refusals and denials for all people, but our interest specifically on the LGBTQ plus community, specifically with abortion access and gender affirming care.
And it's worth noting that it is the task force that brings us creating change every single year, which is, I always say, the boot camp that so many of us grew up going through. So both of your organizations do so much. So I'm going to admit to you both a little point of frustration that I have had, which is it feels like it's only fairly recently that talking about reproductive health and the right and protecting things like Roe became a conversation that I heard a lot in LGBTQ spaces. I certainly heard some people talking about it, but not everybody. And suddenly I'm noticing people coming out of the woodwork, and I'm not complaining about that. Why do you think reproductive health, and particularly the topic of abortion, because we do need to say the word, has not necessarily been connected to LGBTQ issues? And maybe, Lauren, we can start with your perspective, and Gillian, I'd like to hear what your perspective is on this too.
Sure. I think part of that connects to just the erasure of LGBTQ plus people within the world in general and at large. A lot of times in the reproductive rights space, it has focused on white cisgender women. So in a lot of ways, that has kind of changed throughout the year, throughout advocacy, and really with the efforts of Black women reframing reproductive rights around the model of reproductive justice versus, reproductive access, specifically abortion, and widening the idea of what reproductive justice means and looks like, and abortion access means and looks like. And I think also partly allowing the queer community to become more progressive within itself and acknowledge the importance of trans individuals and trans rights, which has led us to know, for certain that there are multiple types of people that can become pregnant and require abortion access and reproductive health. And I think those two things working to catch up on to one another have kind of brought us in this moment where, it is more understood that queer rights, LGBTQ plus, are reproductive rights.
Thank you. Gillian, what would you add to that?
Sure. I think I would echo the point that oftentimes the parameters of the discussion haven't really allowed for queer ways of starting families, the ability of queer lives to decide if, when, and how they should start a family, as well as the limits around who has or needs an abortion. We know that 1 in 4 pregnancies amongst transgender men, for example, ends in abortion. So I think part of it has been an effort to, since the conversation around abortion can be so politically heated, particularly over the course of the 50 years since Roe, there is, I think, an effort to simplify it and make it as clear-cut as possible. Unfortunately, what the lesbian author Sarah Schulman used to call the gentrification of the mind,
yes.
The simplification process and trying to weed down issues into little micro bite-sized pieces. Unfortunately, that simplification ends up erasing the experiences of people who are most harmed by the very policies we're opposing, like the bans on abortion.
Yeah. And that is, by the way, one of my very favorite books. In the article that we're sharing with people who are watching this week, the writer interviewed Evan Wolfson. He was quoted as saying, and I want to read this: "The threat to the freedom to marry is real, but there are even bigger and more imminent dangers that we need to address. And if we address those dangers, we'll protect ourselves against the potential threat to the freedom to marry that may be down the road." So I have to admit, I'm always paying attention to what people around me are talking about. And I have heard a lot of people around me go right from Roe to marriage, completely sort of skipping over all of the healthcare implications of this. Gillian, maybe we can start with you on this one, because I think some of this is about how it's been talked about, as well as the legal connections too. So could you talk a little bit about what that connection looks like? And Lauren, I'd love to hear you add to it. What exactly is at stake that connects these two things?
Sure. So I think you're right. There is sort of a tendency to look around the road towards similar things, right? And say like, oh, are the people who went after Roe going to go after LGBT rights next? And of course, they are going after LGBT rights right now. really terrifying in many ways and traumatizing impact of policies like we've seen in Texas that have targeted the parents of transgender youth. That is a matter in court right now, and a matter of lobbying by many of the same people who have fought for abortion bans. So I think it's important when we look at sort of, is XYZ right next? There are members of the LGBT community who are having their existence criminalized right now, who are having their healthcare criminalized right now. And it's important, to that author's point, to sort of pivot to who are the folks who are feeling the pain right now, and how can we center our search for solutions and our defense strategies and our organizational strategies around them first and foremost, because that's going to help protect us. That said, we also know that Justice Alito, in the leaked opinion in Dobbs, also called out several precedents that he said may need revisiting upon similar strategies, even if he did create a barrier and sort of stating clearly that this ruling does not directly impact those rulings. And amongst them was Obergefell, which affirmed the right to marry across the country, as well as Lawrence v. Wright, which was overturning, anti-sodomy laws. He also called out, Loving v. Virginia, which or affirmed the right to, or overturned laws banning miscegenation across the country. So I think it's important to understand and approach with clear eyes the full scope of what the anti-abortion movement is a part of, which is really, sort of rolling back the decades on social progress, while also understanding that that is already happening in many ways, and that particularly amongst transgender people, the same movement organizations, the same movement dollars are already targeting transgender people and already targeting their families.
Yeah, the threat is already here. Thank you. Lauren, looking at it from the legal perspective, the connections for people who maybe don't immediately understand that, how would you explain it?
So I would explain that the reason that abortion is determined as a constitutional right is because the Supreme Court has interpreted this idea of privacy. Not that privacy is stated or protected within the Constitution, but within the 14th Amendment, we have these liberty protections. So this idea that we have substantive and procedural rights that the states and the federal levels must protect. And in that, the Supreme Court has sort of expanded this idea of privacy, which includes Loving v. Virginia. So this idea of being able to marry who you want, even things like contraception access, removing those anti-sodomy laws, the cases that were mentioned. So all of these stem from this idea of privacy. So getting rid of Roe, where the only connection is the 14th Amendment through privacy, connects to this idea that the idea of privacy is no longer protected within the Constitution, which then lends us to believe that marriage is not protected within the Constitution, whether it be Loving v. Virginia or Obergefell. And although there are other cases, or other federal protections, anti-discrimination laws, one, without the Equality Act, queer individuals are not fully protected. And two, it's very clear that this is a litmus test for states to start to begin challenging these other fundamental rights of people.
Yeah, and we are seeing those challenges happening to Gillian's point, an alarming rate. So this year, we know there have been over 300 pieces of anti-LGBTQ legislation introduced. A number of those pieces have become law. Last year, we saw a similar number. We saw some really significant ones become law that actually created a model that we started to see replicated in other states. One attorney in the article that we shared this week actually talks about how an overturn of Roe could accelerate the process of what the legislation that is already out there is doing. Lauren, maybe we can start with you on this one. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what this connection is legally, because again, I'm not sure everybody necessarily tracks how we get from one point to the other, and yet they are so very closely connected. And then Gillian, I want to talk about what we are seeing in terms of impact.
Sure. I mean, in terms of privacy, Roe was one of the earliest cases to kind of protect this idea that what happens within an individual's life and in their home is up to their own self-determination. And so the court, from this idea of self-determination and privacy, has expanded that right to this ideas of what allows an individual to kind of live their free life with dignity and justice kind of involved. Although those principles aren't always upheld, the court has held this standard of, you are allowed to live your life as you so please. Now, with the decision to say that we no longer have Roe, there is no longer a connection, or the court, although in the leaked opinion, tries to kind of carve out this caveat of, well, Roe involves life or death, and these other cases aren't about life or death. So therefore, this is different. With the court in its current standing and the types of decisions that they're administering, it's unlikely that kind of caveat, as in the leak, position, will uphold. Although, we don't know what the final decision will look like. We're still waiting for that. And maybe some of that language will change. Maybe some of their reasoning will change. But as of now, what we're anticipating is that erosion of the right to privacy. And many of the states, there are these trigger laws, basically laws that have already been written and are just waiting for the court to give that go ahead of, this is no longer constitutionally protected, for them to kind of basically fully get rid of any abortion or reproductive access, and many times criminalizing people for even just going across the state borders to receive that care.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Gillian, this speaks to exactly what you were saying, that this war has already started. A judicial decision is just going to add some fuel to the flames. Can you talk about what you are seeing in terms of how this is unfolding and what these connections are?
Well, sure. To that point, much of the country has for some years already lived in a post-Roe landscape. That the undue regulation, the closing of clinics, even just the organizing and targeted protests, the threats of violence, the threats of harassment, have already closed off abortion for a lot of folks particularly folks who cannot, who don't have wealth or privilege enough to surpass those barriers, right? So it's important to understand, I think, when we sort of treat these things as a national emergency, that it's already at a crisis level for a lot of folks, particularly across the South, particularly for Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. One of the other concerns here, hearing Lauren talk about the rights of privacy and its notion as a constitutional endeavor, I think it's also going to be really critical for us to watch how states attempt to enforce abortion bans, particularly ones which criminalize the pregnant person for seeking an abortion. One, we already know that pregnancy is the focus of criminalization, that people who endure a miscarriage are having the cause of that miscarriage played out in court. They're facing threats of jail time. And this is particularly true for anybody who's struggling with substance issues, or maybe is attempting to leave an abusive situation. Two, and this is particularly grim, but the most common, a person is 14 times more likely to die during childbirth than during an abortion. And the number one cause of death for pregnant women is murder. It's very important to understand that forcing people into this position before they are ready, against their will, against their economic capacity to manage it, is exposing them to a broad range of traumas that could really last across their life, outside of just entering a forced childbirth. So I think it's important to call that out, because within the leaked opinion from Justice Alito, he said, oh, well, pregnant people have all nature of civil rights protections and insurance is readily available, and really creating this cartoonish fantasy of what it's like to be pregnant in a country that is amongst the only wealthy countries in the world to fail to provide paid leave, in which pregnant workers are still routinely fired from their job. In which we know that, women's economic lives, they pay a lifelong penalty for every pregnancy they experience. And again, that's to say nothing of the really dire outcomes, the higher rates of abuse and violence that we know pregnant people face. So this is going to play out in exceedingly grim ways, unfortunately. And I mentioned the right to privacy. I didn't finish that point, but we are already seeing states like a legislator in Oklahoma who proposed a state-run database tracking pregnancies and when a pregnancy is detected and the end result of that pregnancy as a means of assessing how and if or when somebody accessed an abortion or the difference between an abortion and a stillbirth or an abortion and a miscarriage. And, we've seen the same far-right organizations that have mobilized for these abortion bans have also invested in fertility apps and are attempting to track pregnant folks through the private sphere, right? And they've invested in crisis pregnancy centers, which have opened across the country and have lured people in. So as far as how we're going to see this impact play out, it's going to depend very heavily on people's economic station. It's going to depend very heavily on people's geographic location and their access to wealth, their access to privilege. But it's going to span from, the stories you already hear of people who, need to take a bus, a plane, and a train in order to find an abortion, to people for whom this is going to be a severely life-altering trauma for them to experience.
Yeah, it is. It's genuinely frightening. It's very funny. As I was getting ready today for this, to record this, I actually was scrolling through news articles, and there was an article right there, and the headline was exactly, this is why you should stop tracking your pregnancy, your period using an app. And when I read it, you have this gut reaction. I know we're all tired of hearing, wow, this really feels like The Handmaid's Tale. We've gone full tilt into it. And some of the stuff, the fiction could not be more bizarre. The reality could not possibly be more frightening than the fiction that we've read. It's not just this particular decision, and it's not any one piece of legislation that we are looking at. We are looking at, as we said, over 300 pieces of legislation that have been introduced just this year. Lauren, as we look at some of this anti-LGBTQ legislation that's out there, a lot of which has to do with healthcare, a lot of which has to do with access, and the vast majority of which directly targets trans and non-binary folks. Do you have a sense that we are going to see some of these laws that are going to get challenged headed up to the Supreme Court? And are we in this for a very long haul? Are we looking at potentially many years of, frankly, very scary battles? And is there any reason for hope? Let me also add that in, because this is all dark.
Yes, it's all dark. It's very scary, and it's a horrible reality for a lot of people in the United States, and disproportionately impacting people in poverty, people of color, indigenous populations. There will continue to be attacks. They grow every single year, and the conservative extremists enjoy rallying their base through these ideas of, othering individuals and attacking basically simultaneously rights of people of color, rights of the LGBTQ plus population, women's access. These will wholeheartedly continue. The likelihood of SCOTUS taking up some of these cases, it depends. I think the Biden administration in their recent executive order have made it very clear that they're here to protect trans kids and protect trans families. So, we have full faith in the administration will continue to defend and uphold and protect those families and do what they're saying they will do and promise to litigate against that. So it really depends on SCOTUS's willingness to touch some of these issues. They are willing to overturn Roe. So, there's nothing that's not necessarily off the table. It is a litmus test. So I think what the hope in the matter is not hoping that SCOTUS may or may not choose to uptake these decisions, but understanding that we have an election coming up in November, and the best thing that people can do is to get out and to vote and make their voices heard and understood, that we will not stand for them attacking our children. We will not stand for them taking away our rights of bodily autonomy, and we will not stand for them working to erase our very existence. And so I think that is where the hope is that, the majority of Americans are on board with these ideas. It is, voting rights and voting access that has, sort of limited who is in charge and who has a say. And so I think that hope is us continuing to mobilize these grassroots efforts and make a change come November to have a Senate more in our favor.
Yeah. And Gillian, we sort of acknowledged how bad things are looking. Do you see anything that could be positive that comes out of this? I mean, sometimes strife really does mobilize people. Unfortunately, I feel like sometimes people mobilize a little after the fact. Is there anything that people should be looking towards? I mean, because even things like right to vote are jeopardized too. So there's a lot of barriers.
Sure. One of the many connections I do see between the effort to overturn Roe and Casey, and the effort to pass these state bills targeting LGBT people is the fact that it's the same organizations and the same people, the same far-right activists. That's because they're emboldened, right? They feel like they feel like this is something that they had fought for and hoped for and poured, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into. So now it's like they've bought a brand new car and they want to take it for a spin, and they want to see who else is, what other rights they can roll back. Where I'll encourage people to look for hope is that it wasn't terribly long ago that ACLU lawyers secured a 6-3 win on behalf of LGBT workers from the Supreme Court under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which a lot of folks said was impossible. A lot of folks said was not going to happen at all. And that was just in 2020. And since then, we've seen the Supreme Court decline to take up a lot of strong victories we've had, including on behalf of Gavin Grimm in Virginia. So I think that there are, in as much as we're prepared for the on-the-ground impact of Roe's likely being overturned, I think it is important to note where we have been able to secure victories, and that when we do see these cases who are, filing certain and attempting to get them to the Supreme Court, that oftentimes these same activists are overplaying their hand, that oftentimes they are not as good at the legal end of things as they like to pretend to be, and that they're playing with tilted dice, right? As evidence that they're often being a bit amateurish in their efforts. And we have, a great network of lawyers, not just at the ACLU, but really across the LGBT rights movement, who are ready and motivated to stand up to these attacks as we have. On abortion, one of the most critical things I think we can point out is that no matter where you're watching this or listening to this, there's an abortion fund in your area who needs your support. And if you're looking for hope, if you're looking for motivation, if you're looking for action, I think coordinating with them, I think donating to them, I think finding ways that you can support them financially and or otherwise, I think is really, really critical, because it's really going to be their work that's going to determine people's access to abortion.
And actually, that is a perfect segue into, we only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask one last question, and that is, what should people do? We are recording this a couple of days early because we need to, because of schedules. We know that by the time this airs, things could look really scary for people. Lauren, can you give people one really important thing that they need to do right now besides check their voter registration, which I think is the most important one, but what should people do if they're feeling fired up, as they should?
I think exactly as Gillian mentioned, being able to donate to abortion funds in potentially nearby states that are allowing abortions and preparing for the influx of individuals that are going to be coming over and seeking that care.
Thank you. And Gillian, one more thing besides donate, which I think we could all agree on, anything else people should do as they are feeling fired up besides stay fired up too?
Yeah, well, stay energized. I think that, I just published a piece on the ACLU's blog about the purpose of trans joy, and a moment when a lot of trans people are feeling very dark. I think that, hopelessness is as dangerous as naivety. So don't give in to blind optimism, but likewise, don't give in to, blind pessimism, to believing that things are perennially this bad and they're always going to be this bad. It's important to understand these activists didn't take the court by thinking in the short term, right? And I'm thinking of, in July, we're going to be swearing in Justice Jackson, right? And she will be on that court when Clarence Thomas leaves the court. She will likely be on the court when Samuel Alito leaves the court. So it's important to understand that we need to think of these things in a long scope and understand that, people died fighting for rights that we enjoy today, and we need to act with a similar spirit, a similar motivation, and a similar energy.
Thank you both. This was exactly the conversation I actually needed to hear, and I think a lot of people needed to hear it too, because it's scary out there, and anyone who doesn't think that it is really probably not paying attention to the facts. Thank you both for everything that you're doing. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all that your organizations do. They make such unbelievable contributions to who we are today and where we're going to be moving forward. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, we wrap up another show. It is a tough week and it is going to continue to be tough, but we are going to keep fighting and we are going to keep giving you all the information that you need to continue that big fight. So we wrap up the exact same week, reminding you of 3 really big things. The first one is to run fast. The second one is to laugh hard. Don't let them take your queer joy away. And the third one is to be kind. Let's always behave better than our opposition. If you need support, please remember you can find your local chapter at pflag.org/find. Until next week, stay safe and we'll see you on Something to Talk About Live.